What is the difference between the greatest of all time and an average fighter? What's the difference between a great champion and a mediocre champion? A lot of the time it's longevity. It's like the number one conversation in any GOAT debate, in any greatness debate. It's how long can you do it for? If you're the greatest of all time for 1 year, people will care, but not all that much. How many one-year wonders do we see in every single sport? So how long you can hold a belt for matters just as much as how good you are when you hold that belt. And what we're getting into today is going through the longest and shortest reigns inside the UFC. Starting off, we have to lay some ground rules. The first one is that reigns are collective. So if you're a 170-pound champion twice, we count the days for both of them together. And we also don't have a new champion in there to be the shortest champion, because they could go on to, hold the belt for 3,000 more days and nobody would know. So it's unfair to go, oh, well, Khamzat Chimaev won his belt 40 days ago. Let's put him as the shortest UFC middleweight champion. Starting off at 125. 125, the longest, which shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody, is Demetrious Johnson. Demetrious Johnson held the belt for 2,142 days, from 2012 to 2018, and he had 10 defenses in that time. The reason why Demetrious Johnson is almost considered not a top 5 fighter anymore, even though a lot of people have him in their top 3 like me, is because of the first 5 defenses. The 10 defenses number sounds incredible. The first 5 defenses were kind of ugly. You got John Dodson in there, you got Moraga in there, you got Joseph Benavidez in there, you got Bagatinov in there, you got Carasso in there. Like, these are not household names, and these are names, if you ask somebody to name DJ defenses, most of them are probably forgetting. Although he does have elite wins. Like, the Henry Cejudo win is an elite win, the later half of his career is an elite win, and even what he was able to do in one, I think needs to be respected. Then, the shortest for 125 is Brandon Moreno. To be honest, with 125, they've only really ever had elite champions. It's kind of similar to 145 in that aspect, where for Brandon Moreno, yes, it's 224 days, and he has 2 separate reigns and didn't get defenses, but it's like him and Figueiredo are kind of in the same bracket of skill as a champion, at least in my eyes. And then above them, you have like Cejudo, who's a double champ. You have DJ, who we already talked about, and you have Pantoja. So it's not really his fault that he's the shortest UFC champion at that 125-pound division. And I don't think anybody really, talks down on him because of it. Then we go to 135. 135, who held the belt for the longest time? 135 is one of the weirdest divisions ever, because the longest is Dominick Cruz. Dominick Cruz held the belt for 1,465 days over 2 different reigns, from 2010 to 2014, and then for all of 2016 he held the belt. And in those 4 defenses, I'm not gonna lie, the names are a little bit fraudulent, but it was a different time. He did beat Uriah Faber twice, then DJ at 135, who wasn't really the DJ that we know, and then TJ Dillashaw. But we do have to consider, for a ton of his reign, he was super injured. And the shortest reign at 135 is Renan Barão. Renan Barão was a champion for 138 days. And that sounds very little. That does not sound like a lot at all. But we do have to consider with him, we're only counting undisputed champions. So we're not counting how long you are an interim champion for, which he was an interim champion for 534 days. Yes, for over a year, nearly a year and a half, Renan Barão was an interim champion. And he had defenses on the interim belt, even something Tom Aspinall refused to do. So he did only have 1 defense in his time as a champion. That was against Uriah Faber. You're going to see his name pop up a ton here at 135. And then when he's an interim champion, he beat Faber to win the interim championship and then defended it against Mike McDonald and Eddie Wineland. So once again, not really the best names on the planet when you look at who he defended his interim championship against, but those were the title contenders at that point. Then at 145, the longest champion of all time, this should come at a surprise to absolutely nobody, and you can kind of start to see a trend with when we're talking about longevity and GOAT debates and everything. All of the longest champions of all time are in the GOAT debate because they did it for so long. And at 145, it's Jose Aldo. Jose Aldo held the belt for 2,037 days. 2,000 days Jose Aldo held the belt for. That is insane. He held the belt from 2010 to 2015, where he had 7 defenses, and then he held the belt from 2016 to 2017, where he had 0 defenses. But then after the Conor McGregor thing, which after getting KO'd by Conor McGregor, he was never really in his prime, but from 2010 to 2015, when he got those 7 defenses in his prime, he beat the Korean Zombie, beat Chad Mendes, beat Frankie Edgar, and he was also a WEC champion. Like, if we're taking all-encompassing things with Jose Aldo, he went nearly 10 years unbeaten. If we can extend those days a lot more, if you're considering the 145-pound division of WEC, his streak gets a whole lot longer. But Jose Aldo still with 2,037 days. And then the shortest one is Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor only held the belt for 350 days. And for being truly honest, Conor McGregor should have been stripped from that 145-pound belt a lot sooner than that. But obviously, when you have a global superstar who just KO'd Jose Aldo inside 1 round, you're going to want to give him all the opportunities to promote himself as the first simultaneous double champion in UFC history. So he had 0 defense on that 145-pound belt. Yet he's probably still the most memorable 145-pound champion on the planet. ever. Then we go to 155. Continuing the tradition of, longest standing champions being GOAT contenders, we have Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib Nurmagomedov, although he wasn't the most active in his reign, he did hold the belt for 1,077 days. From 2018 to 2021, he was the best fighter probably on the planet for all of that span. He had 3 defenses in that span, and they were 3 iconic performances. Beats Conor McGregor, then beats Dustin Poirier, and then probably in his best performance ever beats Justin Gaethje, then retires. One of the only UFC fighters that we can actually say went out on top. Usually every fighter, whether it's not even in a loss like Jon Jones retired, there's very, very few UFC fighters that go out where we could say he was probably at the peak of his career, and that kind of adds on to the Khabib lore. Then for the shortest, we have Eddie Alvarez. Eddie Alvarez was a champion for 128 days. 128 days. From July to November 2016. I'm kind of a big guy for that Eddie Alvarez is underrated, and I feel bad for Eddie Alvarez because everybody only knows him because Conor McGregor beat him. That's the only reason most, at least casual fans, know who Eddie Alvarez is. And although he had 0 defenses, I still think that the Underground King, his performance against Rafael dos Anjos, Eddie Alvarez is still really, really good in my mind. And I think he deserves respect, at least as a UFC champion, whereas he probably gets disrespected more than he gets respected. Then at 170. 170, the longest reigning 170-pound champion of all time, is Georges St-Pierre. Georges St-Pierre held the belt for 2,204 days, from 2006 to 2007, where he got 0 defenses, and then from 2008 to 2009, where he got 9 defenses. The most notable of those being he beat BJ Penn, he beat Nate Diaz, he might have beat Johnny Hendricks, at least to the UFC. He beat Johnny Hendricks, and his only loss during that entire time was to Matt Serra in what's one of the biggest fluke upsets of all time. I don't want to say fluke because he was the one that landed the punch, but one of the biggest upsets of all time. So GSP reigning for 2,204 days. That's super impressive. That's super, super impressive. A lot of people will bring up the strength of the division and the strength of the defenses, but I think for you to be able to hold the belt for nearly 7 years is that's something different when it comes to UFC fighters. Then the shortest one of all time, another one that I don't really love putting in here, but we kind of do need to include it, is BJ Penn. BJ Penn only held it for 107 days, but realistically, it might be even more impressive that BJ Penn held his belt at all, considering that he was essentially a 170-pounder that should have 100% been fighting at 155. BJ Penn probably did not have to cut a lot of weight, if any, to make 155, and he was fighting at 170, and he was a champion at 170. So that's pretty impressive in itself. He was a champion from January to May 2004, and we all know that his best stuff comes at that 155-pound division. There's no argument, there's no hiding that. Then at 185, the longest reigning champion, I believe the most underrated champion in UFC history, and someone that I'm trying to push as much propaganda as I can because a lot of people just won't have watched him, is Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva, people are trying to sneakily bring him out of GOAT debates. And Anderson Silva, people are trying to sneakily sneak him out of their top 5 and their top 3 fighters of all time. And I hate it. Anderson Silva held the belt for the longest of anybody on this list. He held the belt for 2,457 days. 2,457 days. Think about that. He had 10 defenses. He held the belt for over 7 years. Anderson Silva, I feel like, is a legit IQ test in mixed martial arts. Of where you rate Anderson Silva is how much I can trust you as a UFC fan. Because a lot of people will have him at 7 or 8 or 9. You just didn't watch him. And you just don't want to go back and watch him. And that's okay, that's fine. I think that GOAT debate should obviously be defined by eras, but when we're talking about how dominant someone was against their competition, because Anderson Silva can't fight people that don't want to fight him, like GSP not wanting to move up to 185, Anderson Silva can't do anything about that. So when he was in his time, going up against people that he went up against, he was the most dominant. He's probably the greatest striker the UFC's ever seen, even 10, 12, 15 years later. I think Anderson Silva is massively underrated. And then the shortest of all time is Dave Menne. A lot of you probably don't know that name, and that's kind of for good reason. Dave Menne held the belt for 105 days from September 28, 2001 to January 11, 2002. This is when the UFC was kind of a promotion, just about a promotion. And to tell you the space that the UFC was in back then, he beat Gil Castillo in his first ever UFC fight. Not Gil Castillo's first ever UFC fight, Dave Menne's first ever UFC fight. And then he would go on to lose the belt in his very, very next fight to Murilo Bustamante. Not only would he go on to lose the belt, he went on a 6-fight losing streak after that as well. At 205, the longest champion of all time is obviously Jon Jones. Jon Jones being who's probably the unanimous GOAT inside mixed martial arts, or actually definitely not unanimous, but probably the majority GOAT inside mixed martial arts. Held the belt for 2,098 days, so just short of 250, 260 days shorter than what Anderson Silva did, and he had 11 defenses in that span. The problem with Jon Jones is he could have held the belt for a ton longer. Jon Jones could be number 1 in this by far if he just wasn't addicted to drugs, because obviously he held the belt from March 2011 to April 2015, then loses the belt for all the reasons that Jon Jones has lost the belt in his career, and then gains it back December 2018 to August 2020. And these are two very different reigns for Jon Jones. Whether I describe it to anybody who doesn't really know, the first reign is why Jon Jones is considered the greatest of all time. The second reign is why people say Jon Jones is not the greatest of all time. In the first reign, he beat Alexander Gustafsson, he beat Daniel Cormier, he beat the premier contenders of that 205-pound division and beat a lot of them with ease. And in the second reign, he just about beat Dominic Reyes. He just about beat who would probably not be top 10 guys in his first reign. And finally, the heavyweight division. The longest reigning heavyweight champion was Stipe Miocic, who held the belt for 1,372 days, from 2016 to 2018, and then 2019 to 2021. And his 4 defenses, I feel like, don't get talked about enough. There's some guys who I feel like have 6 or 7, and I'm like, all of those defenses are kind of stinky, where Stipe Miocic has 4 rock-solid defenses. He beat Alistair Overeem when he was, like, Ubereem. Then he beat Junior Dos Santos. Then he beat Ngannou. And then he beat Daniel Cormier. Daniel Cormier was in his second reign after losing to him. So I feel like Stipe Miocic doesn't really actually get the respect that he deserves. And there's people are kind of already giving Tom Aspinall the greatest heavyweight of all time type of tag, when Stipe Miocic has done a lot to earn that. And Tom Aspinall will need to do a lot with the guys that he's going to face to Stipe faced to earn that tag. And then finally, the shortest heavyweight champion of all time is Rico Rodriguez. Rico Rodriguez, the shortest heavyweight champion of all time. He held his belt in 2002, and he held it for 154 days. And once again, this is kind of back in the UFC where it was like, is the UFC even a promotion? Are we going to all these different promotions? Should I just leave and go to Pride? I'm going to whoever pays me the most. So it wasn't really mixed martial arts back then. But that is the longest and shortest reigning UFC champions of all time. Please do make sure to like, subscribe to the YouTube shit. I'll catch you boys tomorrow. Peace.